Welcome to the Shit Show. My name's Andrea Edwards.
I'm David Coe.
Here I am, Richard Bussolato, bottom left.
And my name is Joe Augustin. And together, we're the S team. We've come together to try and untangle the poly crisis, which to some people is a bit of a mystery itself. It's all the different things that are happening simultaneously in the world. It's all kind of affecting us, and it's all a problem. Some people have. I've been hearing the word "shit show" actually being used quite liberally by quite a lot of people recently. So I'm going to take some credit for that. I think our show maybe has had an influence.
Yeah. Or
it might be just that. We're just a mirror, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Intersecting crisis, all overlapping and happening at the same time. So yeah. So David wasn't able to join us last week.
I'm actually going to do some of the social media stuff as well, just at the beginning here right now, right? So if you're watching this now, just joining us, give us a like, that kind of a, preemptive like, if you like. The word preemptive may come up in the show again. Give us a preemptive subscribe as well, because you never know. You might like the show, you might like what it is, and so that when we come on next time, you'll get an alert as well. And hopefully you join us live for the discussion. So yes, on to talking about our absentee member from last week.
We missed you because it was quite a spiritual conversation, so we know you would have enjoyed it. It was fantastic, but we didn't get any time to talk about the news, and there's still some news items from last week that we've put in for this week that we want to talk about. But I think maybe we can do that, alternate between guests and just news focus every other week or something if we have to, especially right now. Like when people are talking to me, they're just so overwhelmed by everything that's going on. They can't see straight. So, people are struggling, and we like to help people. The G7's a topic for this week. I haven't had time to look at that at all because there's so many other things that I'm paying attention to. My browser tabs are just full of opened articles I haven't got time to read. How are you guys coping with it all? The maelstrom.
Not.
Yeah.
I think it's been incredibly busy for news. A lot of potentially pivotal news that will influence us for quite some time to come. And then today is Midsummer Day in Sweden, so it's a very big day. It's probably our second biggest holiday of the year after Christmas. So yeah, it's been pretty busy overall, I have to say. It's
that's when the Swedes, especially up from the north, get to be able to say, we can stay up all night, all day, and from now on is months of sunshine.
Yeah, I mean, it's since I haven't lived there for 30 odd years almost, but I've been up maybe once or twice this time of the year. You forget how incredibly bright it is when you get up there, and having said that, Stockholm is not particularly far north. You have 2/3 of the country above there, but even there, it's like 90 minutes and it's not complete darkness. It's like sun goes down, but it doesn't get dark. And then the sun is up full throttle at 3 a.m. again. It's quite weird.
Yeah. I remember watching this Swedish detective story. And in that, there's this scene where the detective's in this house and there's like a little young, youth disco going on there, kind of like, sort of 18, 20-year-olds stuff. And it's all kind of, the little colored lights and that kind of thing that you imagine, quite dark and stuff. And then she goes outside and it's bright sunlight. It's middle of the night. It's not bright sunlight. It's that sort of cold-y sun light that you get in that way. It's just made me think, wow, you know what? Really, the sun doesn't go down where they are.
Yeah.
No, it does not. It's weird.
As someone from the Southern Hemisphere, I could never get used to it. Winter was worse, where the sun sort of comes up and you can kind of see it for a minute, then it's gone and it's just dark again. I hated that. Mm-hmm. I definitely got the sads when I lived in the UK. It was very miserable for me.
That's midsummer. So, like you said, absolutely lots of things on the news. And you know what? The thing that does concern me, and again, to borrow Joe's word, preemptive, this sort of preemptive strike that we're seeing, especially in Iran, in that way. I think the piece that I get from it that people don't mention is China from this. 90% of Iranian oil goes to China. So if you just think about that, that's a lot in that way.
So before we dig into that, David, should we start off with our not anything else in the agenda, just some news that's caught your attention that is maybe a bit weird or a bit wonderful? Anything?
Can I just state how difficult this particular section of the program is? Because what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to find some things that distracted us and caught our attention that's not going to be actually in the show. So I'm finding myself being very mundane about this. They're painting our flats.
Well, so you must be in the right electorate. You must have voted right in the elections, right?
Well, I think the one thing that does happen here is actually the constant progress of things. So every 5 years, and people don't realize this, but almost every 5 years, and it's not to do with the elections, it is actually to do with the rules that we have for buildings. They have to be maintained. They have to be refreshed, right? So we've literally had that. In fact, before the elections were announced, we actually had our own poll, which was on the color of flats, what the color of the building was going to be. And so that all happened, and now we're going outside. And if you left last week for a holiday and you came back, you might be lost because the building is not the same anymore. But yeah, we've had that. So little excitement. I think the cats still know where they are though, so they're okay.
Yeah, they always know where their food is. Richard?
Well, my quirky little left field story for this particular week is that, where I come from, ice hockey is obviously the national game, and it still attracts huge amount of attention for very good reasons, because it is very beautiful, great game to watch. It's for spectators, it's so intense and everything. And the day before yesterday, we ended officially the season with the Stanley Cup final, which to me, I always knew it would run into mid-June. But given the heat wave you have in the UK, and you're in the evening trying to catch up on the highlights, it's like you're still playing ice hockey. And obviously the trophy this year was won by that famous winter town called Florida Panthers over Edmonton Oilers. And it's just weird. And it's more weird when you live where you live. I think in Sweden, that it's going to carry on into sort of June. But one aspect that actually frightens me, and I think connects with what's happening in a lot of other areas of the world, and which cannot possibly be good, is these players play an incredibly physically intense game, and the season for the top two teams end with the final in the middle of June. When I was playing junior, at much lower level, we went back training middle of August, and we went on ice in late August. I am sure these players will be called back for training camp in the middle of July, maybe third week of July. Given the physical the physical exhaustion you have after playing in excess of 100 games during a season, to have 2-3 weeks respite can not in any way be good for the body. And, for another show, maybe we can have a look at what sort of motor neuron disease cases have popped up in modern sport, particularly in the full contact sports, because I think it's a very, very frightening statistics. And at my lower level of understanding, I think this is completely linked to the extraordinary physicality of the game and the fact you have no respite.
Interesting. I wouldn't have picked you as a nice hockey man. But, yeah.
I was too big.
Quite the sportsman.
David, anything grabbed your attention?
Yeah, so on that sports thing, Queen's Club, tennis championship, that's going on. Grass court, which is kind of uniquely British in that way. The thing about it that I didn't know about this until I went there, because Queen's Club is actually down the road from me, is that it's a tiny little courtyard almost in between sort of buildings in West Kensington. And when you go there, the people who live in the buildings next to it are kind of sitting at their windows, looking out at the tournament.
Drinking their Pims.
It must be a fantastic thing. And the area itself is not, it's nowhere near as big a space as Wimbledon in that way. It's just kind of quite quaint. It's just basically one block between, it's like the gap that doesn't exist. It's like in Harry Potter when the buildings open up and you get this little gap in between. There's one there hidden in there. There's that kind of space, and they managed to hold this big tournament in there, which is actually quite exciting when you think about it. You don't necessarily need all the other things and all the other stuff in that way. Okay. The thing that's sad about it is that the Andy Murray arena, which is where they hold the center court, is built so that people can't actually directly overlook it. I think it'd be really nice if people around the area could just watch into that as well.
Okay. Well, hopefully that's not also your distraction at the end, because we've got to do that. So just a couple of things. So last week I mentioned the Tulsi Gabbard, whatever she is, her nuclear threat video that I found very strange. Well, apparently Donald Trump didn't like it either. So that's part of her being a bit dismissed, apparently. The Trump family have released their gold mobile phones. And I was kind of like, okay, all right. So I remember working for a company.
$47.45 a month.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. I know. 47.45. Yeah, that's right. I was like, so in all ways it's weird, and the fact it's going to be made in China and all that sort of stuff, like it's all weird. But I remember years ago when I worked for IDC, an IT research company, and all of the analysts that covered the telecom space, I was like, how long until you guys don't really have any research to do anymore? Because the telco industry it didn't know how to reinvent itself for the world that we have built since. But interestingly, launching your own telco company, there's an acronym that represents it, is a very, very common thing, and lucrative if you get it right. But it's just basically you're like an OEM. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But the real story I wanted to bring attention to is, which kind of feels ironic that it's happening right now. Extreme syphilis symptoms are showing up now. This is a piece in the Atlantic. It's talking about the US. It's not just happening in the US. But what's extreme about it is typically there's all sorts of things that symptoms that they know what they are. But this one is involving the eyes, and people are getting blind because they don't know, like when they go in with these eye issues, the doctors don't know that it potentially could be syphilis. What I found fascinating is since 2018 to I think 2022, there's been an 80% increase in syphilis cases in the US. It just feels like almost a biblical disease. But when I say it's ironic, because of course Hitler was known to have had syphilis as well, right? So it sort of feels weird that it's emerging back in. But anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting piece of news in the mix.
I mean,
I think it's interesting that this is just the lighthearted part of the show.
Exactly. But I find it, I mean, I was mesmerized when you showed me the article, right? You've always been aware of its existence because it's very much a biblical disease. And, a lot of famous people throughout the sort of 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries have had the disease, and it was incurable for a long time.
Yeah.
And for me, it was just one of those things that I would almost have equated with plague or smallpox. Surely it's not around anymore. You never heard of anyone who's ever had it. And I just thought it was gone, more or less. Maybe, like plague, there are a few cases that we isolate in the world and we can deal with them now because we have antibiotics that actually attack it. But the fact that you have hundreds of thousands of cases in the US alone really, really bowled me over.
Yeah,
me too. Yeah,
but is this
the times.
The fact that it demonstrates itself in this way in your site and those sort of things, which we might have done in more time past. But is that because of the variation in the virus itself, bacteria? Or, is there some sort of like the progression of the strain?
It's bacterial, right?
Yeah. So
they mutate too.
They mutate, right? bacteria mutate too, and it must be that it's just evolving as it gets transmitted along the way and time passes.
Or is it the other way around, that we're evolving badly because we've
potentially
got stuff that we're taking in that completely kills off our immune system and our ability to fight it off, including how to deliberately destroy our immune system.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get serious, even though that kind of is, I'm sure.
Yeah, but it was certainly not lighthearted. Let's be clear about that.
I didn't say lighthearted, just more of a wow. That definitely had a wow factor for me. Okay, so I know a lot of people are really, really worried about what's going on in Israel and Iran. I'm concerned that the eyes off Gaza because that has not stopped. Are we heading towards World War III? Will cooler heads prevail? And when you look at the team in the White House, it's hard to believe that that's possible. Will Netanyahu just do whatever the hell he wants and know that Trump's going to back him? Because it kind of feels like he's doing that. I kind of feel like Israel's just saying, and has been for like the last 12 months, we've got an opportunity to wipe out all our enemies and all our concerns. Let's just go. Let's just do it. We've got Trump in the White House. We can get away with it. So, David, do you want to kick us off and talk about some of those wider implications and why this really matters?
You prompted me one thing which I'd momentarily forgotten, but actually is very deep in my mind. Back in the First World War, there's this poet, Wilfred Owen, who wrote lots of war poetry. And one of the most famous one was, in Patris Nobis, whatever, and so on. Some Latin thing that I don't remember, but essentially is to make a mockery of this idea that we die for our country and it's a brave thing and a valiant thing to do in that way. And you think back about the Deer Hunter, the Vietnam War, the sort of films that came about, even MASH, the TV series about that. Is the anti-war concerns come from the people who fight the war see the horrors of it. And that was always the kind of case. And even if you read the Three Kingdoms, that kind of ancient Chinese text about the war and the description of that, it was nothing glorious and glamorous about it in that way. Today's fighting is done remotely. It is like in 1984, where the three major areas of the world, I've forgotten what they're called, have a decision that they have to remain in permanent state of war with each other. But they're going to do this by people actually naturally going off to their dying machines and just dying off in that way. So what you have here is you have completely separated this brutality and violence of fighting. What you have are the civilians being killed. But you don't have these soldiers. The soldiers are glorified in whatever video game form that they do, or the spy in going to the place and setting up the drone factory, whatever it is that they might have been. And that's a horrific thing, because it means that we are heading into a state where war is just something that happens. And everyone is a bystander, and no one is actually involved in that fighting. And there are victims. And we're all victims, and there are victims in the hospitals, there are victims in the flats, in the apartment blocks. But if you think of what's actually happened over this time, the fighting in Ukraine has gotten a lot worse. And again, it's this sort of remote drone type thing. The disaster and the deaths and the murder of all the people in Gaza by siege, the number of people killed waiting for aid in Gaza. All of those things have disappeared off for this kind of very theatrical conflict that's happened. Now, so that's the first part to it. So to start it, what has happened with this Iran and Israel conflict has really embedded and crystallized this sense that conflict doesn't involve people, soldiers fighting in that way. That's a horrific thing, because the brutality of it is what holds us back. And we've lost that brutality of it. We just see victims.
So you look at the war conventions, that have been signed about, who you can kill and who you can't. And all the wars at the moment, all war crime indictments are because they are killing civilians or children, or so like it almost will make the new form of warfare will make all of that stuff obsolete too, right?
Yeah, and it will be horrible. So here's what's going on. It's a ballistic missile war. It's a missile war, basically. Rockets, drones, and those sort of things. Probably something like 2 decades back or more, China formed the fourth, section of its military. Conventionally, we're used to the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and it created the missile force. And you're beginning to hear about the hypersonic missiles in Iran, the Fatah 2, I think. And these are the ballistic missiles basically fall from the sky. You shoot them so far up into the atmosphere, they effectively fall from the sky, and the journey time is very short as a result. But you can see it because it goes all the way up in the atmosphere and falls from the sky. The hypersonic missiles are supposed to fly lower and at very fast speed, so that you don't really see it, you don't really have that signaling time, and so on in that way. But all of these things operate on the basis that you don't have soldiers actually having to go and fight in that way. They never die. They're just in their little, kind of video game bunkers, playing in that form. Nothing prevents these weapons from getting pretty horrific. The Chinese ones have nuclear warheads, for example. And the US wants to blow them out of the sky. So the Chinese are probably looking at this and says, fantastic, you know what? You cause a nuclear explosion in the air somewhere in the Atlantic or the Pacific. We just got to time the wind direction to be right. And then your entire country is now going to lock itself down. We don't need to do anything else. You're the one who's creating the explosion. Right? So warfare is becoming very, very different. And people are not aware of that, and they're allowing that to happen in that way. And the people still think of war in the way that it used to be fought. That somehow, there are soldiers and there are people in that way.
But I suppose when you look at the Ukraine-Russia war and you sort of see the meat grinder, God, I hate that term, of Russian forces, like a million men killed, I suppose that's probably why people are still sitting in that thinking of, because Richard, I think it was last week when you were talking about AI jets versus AI jets, fighting in dogfights, right? And you kind of think, what? What? How does anyone win that?
I think this is the point. If I may just finish off there in that way, what happens is that nobody wins it. It carries on, and civilians need to die. That's what war is becoming.
Yeah. So the profiteering is obviously made by the people who are building the equipment. I did say a long time ago, if you want to invest in shares, go for the defense industry, right? But yeah, all the robotics, all the planes, all the weaponry. So it's a forever war future that we're moving towards.
In 1984. Is that there is this forever war. There's 3 kind of blocks in there are in permanent forever war, and it supports this very kind of messed up perception of the economy.
Yeah. And then you've got Space Force in the mix as well, right?
Yes.
And China's definitely moving ahead in that direction too. So
And going back to my comment earlier about Iran and what this means is that actually, the US undoubtedly is trying to think, okay, how do we increase the pressure on China in that way? And I just want to add a completely different, apparently different segue to this. Yesterday I had a series of calls in the morning and conversations, really exciting conversations. One with a lady in Hong Kong, a gentleman in South Korea, followed by a call with a young man in Kenya, followed by a conversation with a young man in the UK, and then someone in Amsterdam in that way. And all these people have a desire for a better world, a world where people is what matters along with that. So we live in a world today where it's possible for people genuinely from all around the world to get together and have conversations and get to like each other or not. Against this, what you have is a hegemony of power in a structure carried over from a long time past that is desperately trying to maintain its kind of old storytelling of the enemy. They are the enemy. Those are the enemy. And when you come down to it, really, what's the issue with people in different places making different things for other people to use? And, you know, if they, this the aspect where they say, well, they've taken our jobs by manufacturing those things there instead of here. That applied as much to the chocolate factory down the road versus the one over the other side in the time before. It honestly is no different in terms of what's going on. The question is, how do you find yourself and your own identity? And that's what our conversations are about.
Yeah.
So that you can find your place in the world. But these wars that are going on, the driver to it is all false stories. All of those drivers to it are false stories. I created this word called silent venom, which is the poison of the things that you do not tell.
Yeah, but it's very logical, because throughout history, what defines an empire is its ability to identify the enemy, because that's what gives the structure and the cohesion of that existing empire. We have an enemy, hence we can justify our existence and the means we take to combat that enemy. If you don't have an enemy, the reason for maintaining the status quo kind of vanishes, right? And there are strong forces who wants to maintain the status quo.
And that's what you've always said, is that you don't need to listen to that. You know, we have individual sovereign economic power as individuals on how
Absolutely.
we spend money and what we do. And I think that is really a layer of governance, you know, we don't appreciate. And that's really, you know, the most simplest thing is not, we had conversations with people about, you know, how we can change political parties, how we need this political parties and those sort of things. It's actually every political party ultimately is a local political party in terms of kind of, and actually the ability for people to form that governance. And as Richard has said before, you know, that's the message of Elinor Ostrom. How did you describe her as the economist?
But she's certainly one of the most influential.
I think you were saying something like
I like her. But she has had the ability to identify at a human level, at an individual level, that our actions matter, and we find a way to actually forge the societies that we wish for if we delegate that power to the communities. And she showed that it actually does work. We can set our own norms, and we can set our own economic rules for how this community will operate.
And to give
So, David, I think
give
you're
a
having some
indication-
problems. Are you having some problems with your Wi-Fi? Is that what's happening?
Yeah,
you-
I think
yeah,
I'm having some problem with heat.
yeah. Just make you aware
if
of
I
it.
may just to finish off with one comment, and the comment is that I'm just going to try and lift my laptop up so that there's more airflow, and then for it to cool.
Okay.
And that's the issue of oil price.
Yeah.
Oil had fallen down to below $60. That's below the price where the U.S. manufacturers can make a profit. Now it's gone back up because of what's going on.
Yeah.
The countries in the Middle East, Iran, as much as Saudi Arabia and others, need oil price higher, much higher, in order for their national budgets to balance. When you look at it in that way, the incentive to continue this in this way, where it just kind of like lobs things at each other and keep it going, so few civilians have to die, that's just the way it is the collateral cost of being able to keep our regime, our status quo going. And that's as much for the US as it is for the countries in the Middle East. And it's as much for people like China, which is kind of concerned about what's going to happen to our supply of energy. That 90% of Iranian oil makes up 16% of Chinese oil, of the oil China imports. And China imports a large amount from Russia. It's not going to try and import more from Russia. Things are really, the other part that people don't realize is that production is very much at the capacity. Certainly at the capacity of what the current economics can allow it to. It's not that we are not producing as much as we can. We literally are producing as much as the price is allowing to do.
Yeah.
So they get oil from Russia and Iran, but they also get it from Saudi. And obviously the Saudi-Iran history is a bit complicated. So
Yeah.
what do you see from how China gets pulled into this? What has to happen? Because they've been stocking up on oil, for this year, right? So they've got a stockpile, but what's that implication?
Well, the pessimist, the conspiracy theorist in me, says this is a battlefield opportunity to test hypersonic missiles against a missile defense system.
Right.
So whether that's in part or otherwise, an opportunity like this hasn't existed.
Yeah, but China has got the coolest head of them all when it comes to responding. Right? They've not sort of stepped up to the plate on that front yet.
They don't want to, because China by itself rather likes to. As having this conversation with a friend who was saying, well, you say all these things, I think it's because for China, a century is a moment. It rather lets them kind of work it out. If it takes a century, the leaders don't necessarily feel that they have to be the one that is the ultimate legacy in that way.
Yeah.
No, they're playing the ultimate long game because they have a political structure that allows the leadership of China to actually play the long game. You're not going to elections to get replaced if the people are a bit pissed off with you. So that structure in and of itself lends itself eminently to playing the long game and really strategic thinking. You don't need to react.
But regime change is a real issue, because regime change basically means that all sources of its oil, except for Russia, is now under US control. And it will not accept that.
So the Saudi is under US control? Saudi oil?
Yeah, I would say so. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I would say the Middle East, ex-Iran, is under the US sphere of influence. Obviously, Canada and the US are very much so, including Mexico. Then you have a few places here and there that are not totally under US control, but they're not actually that meaningful in total production. You have a few African states. You maybe can throw Norway into the mix. If you look at the 100+ million barrels of oil being produced around the world, Iran is by far, outside of Russia, the most important producer that is not under US control. Everything else is kind of more piecemeal. And you have rigs everywhere now, and you have fracking everywhere. But meaningful chunks of oil coming to China essentially comes from Russia and Iran. And then they buy what they can in the open market, but that leaves you very exposed.
So what percentage would that be, global oil under US control? What, 90, 95%?
No, less than that. Russia produces 12% of global oil, in Iran another 5%, and you probably have another 10 to 15. So I would say 70% is a ballpark number that's under US sphere of control. Yeah.
Wow, that's a fact I've never been aware of. Very interesting.
Yeah, and China, you know, out of that remaining 30%, probably buys almost 50% of that remaining 30%. And then you have a few other major importers. And I think it's not totally clear where a huge consumer like India sits in that pyramid. But it's a really, really important aspect if you factor in the security concerns that every country around the world will have. Where do we get our future energy from if this really escalates? If the Iranians go down the really hardball route, I'm sure they can close the Strait of Hormuz. And then you're starving the world of like 25, 30 million barrels per day.
I think that's a really difficult step to go to. What happens is the consequence of that, the gamesmanship of that you're going to get as that happens. Almost certainly you're going to bring in a lot more direct military action, and even China would not want them to do that.
No, absolutely
there
not.
Be very little support in that way for that as an actual action. But what happens is, if you think about what it means happening in China, you've got the top end that's being restricted at the moment. This is in terms of the AI and the chips and kind of all of those stuff that's going on. Oil is down at the other end. Oil is basically down to the villager and the ability to go along and grow crops and actually feed themselves and others along. Yeah. So it sees essentially this US sphere of influence desperately trying to tighten in. And if I may go back and say, you know, think about the last Chinese person you met. Okay, I'm Chinese, so, you know, it's easy for me to do that every morning. But again, in the conversation with people, people don't really recognize the China in the same way as they see the Chinese people that are around in that way. There is this sort of mythical China, which is some great evil around, and there's this mythical Iran, which is some great evil around in that sense, in some sense in that way. But there are Iranians all over who work along, and we meet sort of Iranians who regularly go back to Tehran to meet with their family, come back, and they love it there when they're there. They love it here, and all that sort of things. And this goes back down to the people. The people in these countries are like people anywhere else. And this war is like this fictitious kind of construct that's been created. It has very beneficial purposes. It keeps the oil industry very happy, raises the price of the oil, allows them to go on through. It keeps all the regimes happy. And this is regimes as much as is, you know, Canada's happier now because of the price of oil than it was a few weeks ago. Yeah, even in a country like that, but we never explicitly say it. The US oil companies were basically trying to figure out, what do? We can't afford to drill, to now say, fantastic, we can keep pumping out more. And
just another way war destroys the environment, right?
Yeah, and so it's feeding into those things. And when you don't have people actively actually fighting, losing the arm, losing the leg, and doing those things in the fighting and coming back, you don't have their families feeling the horror of it. You don't have them living with all of those things. It becomes a case of actually, well, those are the evil ones. They bombed us, and now we don't have our home. So it reinforces that same story, as opposed to having that chap, that Wilfred Owen kind of war porn, the one that actually says all of this supposedly glory is just brutality and cruelty.
Yeah, you know, it's. I just want to sort of maybe just sort of listening to you both. It's a perspective that I think most people would be listening to and going, "Oh my God, that's a," you know, is this the path we're really on? You know, this perpetual war where, you know, life will just be miserable, and the environmental impacts you said in your Ukraine of war, the destruction of water. Forests, all that sort of stuff. I mean, we can't afford war at this point for humanity. Like if we really want to, you know, we'll talk about the environment later, but we've talked a lot about the tech bros, especially from the data AI. Now I think, you know, we should be thinking about the energy bros, right? And the defense force bros. the three of them?
I
Like,
think
if
the
you think
correct
They are
about
term
it,
actually is
one and the same.
energy uncles and war uncles. The bros are actually for the younger team.
okay, all right. I don't know. If you think about where defense is going, it's very technology run, right? So it is probably the younger people who are designing these new weapons. But the idea of being in perpetual war, where there are no soldiers being maimed, eventually, you know, we're going to wake up and go, we don't want this, but it might be too late by then, because then there'll be total control over information, over us, over our movements, where we live, how we live. So it's when you look at the dystopian pathway that is being discussed openly, you've just added a layer to that conversation that I haven't heard yet, but I actually think it really makes sense, even though I don't like to think about stuff like that. But it's not a pleasant thing to think about. But if you want to look this in the eye, I think it's important to think about these possibilities, because it's just clicked into place for me that, the Curtis Yarvin, and then add this layer on top, and it's like, that's not going to be a lot of fun. Joe, do you want to jump in with some thoughts?
Well, I was thinking about how in the brutality that we are going to be missing out on, so to speak. I think it's being replaced with a different kind of brutality, which is the brutality of the results of your actions. Because what is different now from then is all the visual capturing of the attacks, of the wars, of the fighting, of the damage and stuff like that. So there is a different kind of brutality, I think, that we are having to face, which is the result of whatever action happens, right? So if you look at the strikes that happen, if you attack, it's like what's happening for Israel and Gaza right now, right? So Israel does what it does, and what we see is what happens in Gaza, and what the rest of the world gets to see as well is that, and Israelis get to see that as well. So I am not as in despair as with David about the fact that there is no there's no witnessing to the brutality of it, because I think what is different now is we are seeing a lot more of the impact of the actions that we take. And if anything, I think we're having to face more the shame of it. The fear that I have is that we get used to it, right? We don't think of it as a terrible monstrosity, or we don't get struck by the enormity of everything. But I do feel that there's a change, there's a switch in the way that the equation goes. And if you think about what was happening, like in the U.S. while Vietnam was happening, it was also about the impact on Vietnam that was upsetting Americans as well. How the war was being waged, and how terrible some of the weapons were. So I think that they're not immune, or they're not insulated from having to deal with the brutality. And the other thought about war is actually it is about putting your ideas, or putting your values to a test. And it's about being willing to defend it, or willing to fight it. It's a bizarre concept. It's a crazy concept. It's about you talking about my mother, and I have to fight you. I mean, that's what really war is about, right? It's about my beliefs. You're upsetting me, and I have to defend my beliefs because of the pride that I have of my situation. And I'm willing to go to XYZ extent to prove this point, right? That really is all war is about. But yeah, I mean, like you're talking about how on a local sense, we all know the people from different places. Like, our helper is from Myanmar, and you hear all the things that happen in Myanmar, and the military and all that. And she's going back for a holiday very soon to meet, her partner, and they're going to be selling flowers for a feast. It sounds nothing like a country that is under military rule. It sounds nothing like the life that we might see from the outside, right? So, yeah, you're right. There's layers and layers of it, and the thing is, we're intertwined in the sense that there is who has power, who has the big stick, in that particular environment.
I just want to just before we go, I think Richard wants to say something, but just before we do, I just want to point out a couple of things that you might have missed. So it's what we see, right? Now we think we're getting a view of what's going on in Gaza, and we are seeing a lot of stuff that's going on in Gaza, but we're not seeing everything. An 11-year-old Palestinian girl who was a social media influencer was killed in one of the bombs, right? So there's been a blackout. But what was really interesting to me, within it's like 24 or 48 hours of Iran bombing Israel, they did a social. They basically went out, and anyone who was posting any of the results on social media within Israel was basically hauled in and said, "You do not do this anymore," and the whole country's gone. So we're not actually seeing a lot of information of what's going on. A lot of media aren't in those regions because they're not allowed to. In Iran as well, that the BBC can't get in there. All sorts of haven't been in for a long time. But the other thing, of course, is trust in information. So that's just falling over, and it has been for the last 20 years. And AI's role is going to change that. So if you've got people who are in charge of the narrative that we're seeing, then we might not actually have access to the truth in the future unless we get a hand on. And all of this stuff that we're talking about, while it sounds so terrible, it's more about, if we're aware of it, what can we do to stop it now? And there's enough people in leadership roles in government that don't want this to be our future, right? So I think that's the kind of the point. But the trust in information, I think, is going to be massive in this future that David's talking about.
I think it already is, actually. Yeah. And it ties back a little bit to what we discussed last week. That I think it was last week. Yeah. I'm getting old. What can I say? Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. However, it's that to have high quality, unbiased, factual news costs money. And people today, particularly the younger generation, don't want to spend money on that. And they might have other priorities, but they do not want to not have news. So they are turning to people who either makes news into some form of entertainment commodity or in very biased format because they actually have other sources of revenue. If you want what I would call proper investigative journalism that unearths stories, that we've seen films about and we love them, it costs money. A journalist needs to eat too, right? Yeah. So if news channels and newspapers are no longer being able to afford investigative journalism, the quality of the output will obviously suffer. And for me, it's really not a path you want to go down, because that's going to be a world effectively dominated by propaganda.
Yeah. I think we're already on the way. Steve's
Absolutely.
saying it's impossible now to figure out which information sources to trust, right? And that's why, I'm always, like in my weekend reads, I'm just sharing so many different sources because, people, I enjoy The Guardian. But then if I only shared The Guardian, I'd be a tofu eating whatever woke, whatever the label is today. But I
nothing wrong with tofu.
What was that?
We love tofu.
Nothing wrong with tofu.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan. But yeah, so that's it's really about using your critical thinking skills, right? Which are dropping off a cliff, and you digest lots of different sources from lots of different angles, so that you can sort of find the trends and the patterns in the information, and the truth is in there. But it takes a lot of effort, and people don't want to put the effort in, although they do spend 3 hours watching a Joe Rogan podcast. So it's not that people aren't willing to spend the time. It's that not everybody is willing to spend the time, and I think that's a problem.
I think it's not so much that. We talk about the distinction between knowledge, understanding, and wisdom.
Yeah.
And we've become a world that's dominated by knowledge. And knowledge is about knowing this fact or that fact. So a lot of the things that we talk about earlier on is kind of like the knowledge of, what Richard was talking about, when you play sport, these happens to athletes, that happens to whatever it is, and so on. The understanding is when you connect that in some ways with people. So that's what this show is about.
Mm.
That's what we're doing here. We take these aspects that we think, and we think that actually these are the things that connect most with people. And that's the understanding. I think of it as like, the sun is hot. That's the knowledge. The understanding is when you cook with it.
Yep.
That's when you connect with people, because different people cook different things. Some cook tofu, some cook steak.
And we love it.
Different way to do that. And finally, the wisdom is when it connects with you about what actually helps you to progress your way through, to actually go and find that purpose that allows you to become more motivated in what you do, that actually makes a change from simply ignoring it all because you're just swamped by it, to actually say, I accept that this full of imperfections, full of flaws and all of those things. And out of that, that means that I now don't have to worry about it being full of flaws and full of misinformation and all those things, because I don't have to worry about it. I can now go and take a step.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. And that's the part which I think, what do we want to do with the shit show? We want people to get past those points. And so the sources of truth and the silent venom, I'm going to keep using that word. I think it's a great word. Of all the things which are really poisonous and hidden along, and it's kind of the lies that are never told in that way by not telling in that way. They are in that way. Is to get yourself to appreciate between the knowledge that's kept from you, even that you don't necessarily need to know that. What you need to know is about that wisdom of how you can accept the world is like that, so that you don't have to worry so much about it and actually take that step. Find that courage to take that step. Uncommon courage.
Yeah, exactly. But okay, so let's just wrap up the Iran bit. So people are feeling really overwhelmed. So is that your advice to people, David? Maybe we can all just sort of give our thoughts on, because people are really struggling with deep fear around this escalation on top of everything else that's been happening for the last few years. It's like it's never ending. So to help people, what would you think? What would you say?
This escalation is like the explanation for toppling Iraq. There's a seed of a fear of some weapon that they have, and therefore we must protect ourselves alone. Conveniently happens at a time to distract from what's going on in Gaza. Conveniently happens in the times to create those other things. Other parties come in and they affect it. For you and me, it matters because it normalizes the brutality of war and it sets it on a different path. I don't think this is something anyone should accept. What steps they need to take about it is to find how they engage with people themselves, with other people around, because that's the source of how they're going to find there's a place for them. If you simply engage as an activist against something all the time, or protesters against something all the time, if you somehow miraculously expect that your government is going to do the right thing and forget that any party in power, the first priority is stay in power, whatever that entails. And any party that's looking for power, their first priority is to get into power, whatever that entails, whoever they need to partner with in that way. Then you're going to end up finding yourself more and more despondent about how things are. But it is in the engagement with people.
They go local.
And today we can do that.
Yeah. Richard, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think if we rewind a little bit to, that the vicious attack on Israel that set all these things in motion, that would never, ever have happened without an Iranian go-ahead to Hamas to do it. And at that point, bearing in mind, which is certainly my understanding of the Gulf and what many people certainly agree with, is that Iran's ultimate aim is to topple the House of Saud. and ensure that Iran becomes the overall dominant power of the region. And they can only achieve that by basically creating regime change in Saudi Arabia. And they saw this as an opportunity for them to seize the overall initiative in the region. Israel responded somewhat predictably, but here I think is where things happened on the quite predictable path. Israel's efficiency in particularly negating any Hezbollah threat with its mini device explosions effectively proved to all the people, and I think there are a lot of people there who would have joined the Iranian cause. And in this sense, Israel is just a distraction, because what they really want is change in Saudi Arabia. Saw that this was a dead-end street, and they crawled away and remained quiet on the whole issue. Israel now sees this as their opportunity to actually, whatever we want to call it, ensure the safety of the state of Israel by whatever means they want to, because actually Iran proved that they were an unreliable, inefficient ally for all the other guys in the region. And all of a sudden, US and China and even Russia becomes involved, because they all have very different objectives and interests in this region. And David elaborated, brilliantly on how China looks upon it. US wants a ban for oil, because it's both a consumer and a producer. US will not accept $100 a barrel oil, because then the US is in recession, because it's a consumer-led economy. US cannot accept $50 a barrel, because actually domestic production will cease in many places. So they want a ban. The Saudis and the others just want a high price. And Russia wants a high price. And if you can constrain exports from the region, they would need to allow Russia back into the fold and probably extract a very heavy price in Ukraine for us effectively becoming the rescuer and the provider of that oil. So now the situation is really, really complex. And I don't see any really good outcomes. And I think the whole idea that you want to create regime change by bombing the shit out of the people who will do the uprising just doesn't work in my mind.
One thing Richard reminded me in that sense is simply that, think about the energy you use.
Yeah.
That's what keeps that demand up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's how you yourself become a pawn in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you can become the master over the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you look at China's massive escalation in alternative energy, right? Maybe this is all part of that story and the motivation. But I don't know, listening to what Richard was saying, I just feel like these are the pieces of the puzzle that needed to come together for me to say, so this is World War III, or potentially at the beginning of World War III, because you need all, it's horrible. But Joe, do you want to?
Well, I was going to add a bit more gasoline to the fire as well, and I think it's the Netanyahu Ponzi scheme that you had to think about too, right? It's where he has tried to build up this thing of goodwill. He's spent it, now he needs to get more, and so what happens is he does something which has a story around it that can, that has the potential to galvanize again and give him back some of that support that he had been losing desperately without this action. So yeah, it's a kind of a Ponzi scheme, and I was thinking about this in terms of politicians who are motivated very strongly by the threat of being arrested after they lose power, right? So you had Trump, who ran the campaign of a lifetime, because it was the campaign of a lifetime. At risk was his life as he knew it, right? And I think Netanyahu is in a similar situation as well. So he's not just making decisions that are based on some of the ideas that are available and put on the table. They're convenient for that particular aspect of his own existence as well. He's, on one hand, it's about keeping power, but on the other hand, it's also about not going to jail. So it's a very, very big motivator. So that's all, I think, all wound up together. I also heard this thing about how the war games simulations that have been done about this, and these are people who were in the White House before as advisors. Trump is now sucked into a situation where the war games have always resulted with the U.S. being involved in further bombing. There seems to be no way for it to progress without that sort of thing happening, and I think that's the very interesting thing that we're going to be. I don't know whether we're getting into it now, but it's also how it's affecting the support he's going to have with MAGA, because the strangest thing in the last week has been a lot of the left-wing commentators, liberal commentators, have been agreeing with MAGA, and that's weird.
All right, but just before, I just want to finish off with a couple of points. So, talking about getting back in the good graces. So, Elon Musk obviously made Starlink available to the Iranians so that they could they could still have access to the internet and be involved in the protests. But the other thing that I think a lot of people are missing is the temperatures in the Middle East in the last few weeks have been 52, 53 degrees Celsius. So when I think of all of those people escaping Tehran because Trump said get out of the city, there's a lot of people like pregnant women who can't, they're like 8 months pregnant, they can't go because they could be stuck in a 20-hour traffic jam on the road and have to give birth. But I think there's a potential that we're also going to see a massive loss of life just because people are in the elements exposed to these extreme temperatures. And I think that's something to sort of keep in mind too. So, but yeah, so moving on to there's a lot to it. I suppose all I want to say to people is keep the faith. Like, I know that the time feels really, really dark, but unfortunately, people don't study history, and that's always been one of my passion areas. So I've always studied history, studied at uni, I loved it at high school, but all my life that's one of the things I've done. And the story of humanity is always a very long arc. It's not always obvious where we're going to go. What David was saying sounds really horrific, but it actually really makes a lot of sense to me based on all of these other pieces coming together. It doesn't mean it's inevitable. It means we need to wake up and make sure it doesn't happen, and however that looks like for you, whether it's getting involved in politics yourself, acting locally, within your own communities, but keeping your eyes well and truly open, and your silent venom. So I find a lot of the venom is actually is very, very public. And a friend of mine always used to say, if you don't want people gossiping about you, put it all out there in the open, because when it's all out there in the open, nobody notices it. But if you do it behind closed doors, everyone notices it. So a lot of the risks that we face are being discussed in open platforms. What we fail, and we've talked about this many times before, we have a failure of imagination. And that is the biggest thing that's going against us. Every person who comes out of an authoritarian regime says we didn't expect this to happen. And I found that I find that a really insightful sort of perspective. So expect the worst, plan for the best, right? But and in the US, the stuff that we're seeing at the moment. So there's been a lot of talk in the last week about Donald Trump's health. It's speculative, so, and that's really hard, right? And people are like, people are celebrating his potential demise, but Vance is next. And I actually think he'd be a lot worse. He's Palantir's boy. He's Peter Thiel's boy, right? So it's not like there's a better option if Trump goes out. We started the week off like straight after the show, right? That parade was, as a former soldier and a mother of a soldier, I felt so embarrassed looking at that parade. I really did. I was cringing inside. So it had a big impact. And then, of course, you see the big protests that are happening this week. I don't know who wants to sort of kick off what's going on in the US. I mean, every single story. I mean, there was an assassination before any of this even happened, and it almost didn't make the news by comparison to because there were so many other things going on at the time, and that whole sort of angle
is hugely troubling. But unfortunately, it is a typical expression of the times we live in and the polarization that's occurred over the last decade in US politics. And the fact that people are not more outraged by what happened is, I think, a clear symptom. Because this is par for the course now in a very polarized society.
I'm kind of so this is going to sound terrible in some ways, right? So America has supported through its kind of covert actions a lot of regime horrible things that have gone on in South America, in kind of Asia and other places. In many of these places, they have had to live through people being taken away by some form of police and disappearing away. They could be going to work one day and find that actually, you know what, they've been taken away somewhere. And that's happening in America. And over what's happening in America, you know, with what was the Marines going into Los Angeles, National Guards, and then the Trump co-opting, coercing, whatever it is, the military to go and arrest civilians in United States grounds, ICE taking them along, taking them off somewhere that you may never see again in that way, is actually the kind of things that have been happening around in different parts of the world. So if you then look at the US and you think about the political assassination of those things, it's just pointing out to say the US has now switched into a different sort of state. And that's the kind of state that we need to start thinking about. And you look at what's, you know, Caroline Levitt, you know, the person, and the way she talks about what's happening and all the rest of it. They are just, you know, echoes of the same thing, right? That you hear in those other places and stuff. And she's good at her job.
She's excellent as a propaganda mouthpiece. I mean, she really is. You know, you see those the pictures of her dressed as a North Korean new TV anchor. It's perfect. It's exactly what she does. Yeah.
No, it's I wouldn't be surprised if she studied quite intensely Joseph Goebbels' modus operandi and how that machinery was built up, because it has huge echoes of that, and the rhetoric has huge echoes of that. All we're missing is, you know, the Nuremberg rally, but maybe the birthday parade was kind of their attempt at that.
Yeah, I could. So one of the things that I feel really strongly is on the cards is I've never seen a more. So if every single person in a leadership position was evil but brilliant, I think we'd have a real threat on our hands. But I've never seen a more incompetent group of people in leadership positions in my life, in every way, right? So the incompetence is astounding. And while they might be being protected, like if you think when that general was assassinated by the US in Trump's last time in power, they threatened to take revenge on Mar-a-Lago, right? If the Iranians have not set up something in the US to do something at some point, I would be very, very surprised. So I think that the incompetence in the US has opened the door to risks that are going to, you know, basically the country's going to fall over. So just their sheer incompetence will do that. But the other thing is, if you listen to the people who are experts in authoritarianism and fascism and stuff, nobody has ever tried to do what they're doing as quick as Trump is doing. And I think even the people like the Project 2025 and the tech bros and everybody behind him, and you hear it sort of commented every now and again. It's like nobody expected him to move as quickly. Like even in Hungary, they've still got rights that he's trying to take away in the US. So authoritarianism usually is effective. It happens gradually over time. He's trying to take away everything all at once. It's been, 4 months, 5 months? And I think that's the potential that's going to make the US fall over. That's just one of my sort of interpretations of what I'm saying. Anyone?
Yeah, I think if if I look at it sort of and it's very easy to do parallels to, fascist ideology and how that manifests itself, because there are strong traits in what's happening, but not only in the US. Let us be clear that the sort of populist authoritarianism is on the rise everywhere. In many ways, Viktor Orban's Hungary has been kind of torchbearer for that kind of philosophy across the Western world for some time. I'm probably a little bit more optimistic on the US for one reason only. You go back to sort of Marinetti's fascist manifest of, what is it? The Modernist Manifest, I think it's called, right? The pillars you need to actually exert the perfect fascist states and remove the people, because clearly they don't know their best, which sits at the heart of it, is you need control of the judiciary, because you need to politicize the courts to ensure that your executive orders cannot be threatened by the judicial system, because that is obviously a huge hindrance in a state like the US. US courts, by and large, still have enormous independence. And even though the Supreme Court has been tilted in favor of people appointed under the sitting president, my sense is still that taking on the US judicial apparatus in a complete takeover into a authoritarian quasi-fascist state is something that the regime in the US is not capable of doing, because it's, even among people that would maybe sympathize with a lot of things that the president tries to do, would effectively back away from that, because it's very ingrained in US society that the courts are the courts. But we see the attack on the judicial system happening all over the Western world, not least in the UK, where there's been masses of expressions, from ministers saying that the courts shouldn't have this power, which is exactly down that route of saying we need to tackle courts' ability to slow down our way of implementing laws. But I think that the judicial apparatus in the US is incredibly strong. That makes me a bit more hopeful than most, I guess. But my sense is that.
There's Amy Barrett Cohen, whatever her name was, the Trump appointed. There was a piece in the Atlantic talking about she's not she's been 50-50 in the way she's voting. So she's not that guaranteed voice behind their movement. So that's that's kind of interesting. And also the what you're saying about kids learn in school about the judicial system and why it's important and why it's independent, but to me that goes to the speed I was talking about. They're trying to do it too fast. You need to reprogram people, and they haven't had time to reprogram and make those changes at the same time, right? So Joe?
Well, they're trying to make what they're doing is bringing in something that the broader audience hasn't really thought about before, right? So I keep thinking about this in terms of, I don't know whether you've had a friend at some point in your life who learned about network marketing, right? So before that point, they probably didn't consider too many things about life. They just had things happen to them and what have you. And then suddenly they've got all these issues and ideas that now become the truth for them, because it comes into focus and it energizes them, right? So in America right now, I think what's happened is a political awakening of what power is about, right? So there's been a great sense of American exceptionalism, but it was always just because we are America. There wasn't as much thinking about the values, the process, and all the different things that went around that, because it was just about the identity of being a member of the team. And what the Republican Party and what Trump has been able to do, well, not so much Trump. Actually, Trump is actually, I think, very successful in what he does because he has the gift of not knowing. And
that is one of the scariest phrases I've ever heard.
Yeah,
because you the well-educated person who understands a little bit about history and understands about the way things have happened and why there's a process and how the judicial system is supposed to work is able in the moment of uttering an idea that should be challenged to know that that's not a good idea. That shouldn't be something that is going to be easy to put through, right? And I think that sense that he doesn't know really frees him up to make these choices. So he's able to do things one after the other, move very quickly through things, because without knowing what was supposed to happen and without seeing what the consequences immediately are going to be, he can move very freely, right? But on the other hand, I think is the rest of the Republican Party that now is taking its time, taking its power. They're trying to move things along as well, so they can have things their way. And to be fair, look, both sides have been doing it a different way, right? I think the Democrats have been trying to figure a way through legislations and rules and tying up of loopholes and whatever that which is probably why they lost the election in the first place. They try to get their way by gaming the rules, right? Now, what is happening on the other side is, well, let's figure a way so that we don't have to follow the rules. How can we change the entire thing? I don't like the way this rule book works. What if we just said new rule book, like in the bill that is going up to be passed, and that was such a terrible thing as well, right? Where the people who voted for it did realize there were so many things in it that were just diametrically opposed to their own beliefs. That I think there's part of the bill there which actually is trying to change the law so that the judiciary has less power.
Yeah,
and that was the bill. That was a bill that was being pushed through, right? So that and then we'll see what happens with that, because it still is a bit of a process. Luckily, that process is not as quick as it is, but that's kind of what's happening. As in a sense, America is waking up to the idea of real politics, right? Where it used to be thinking just in terms of teams. It's still very much ingrained in them, the idea of we're thinking in terms of teams, and everybody's forming the teams and forming their allegiances. But they're only just understanding process. They're beginning to be exposed to the idea of process. And unfortunately, the first source of information tends to be false. People are telling them how something works when that's not really how it works. But because it's the first time you've heard how this works, you go, that kind of makes sense. And it becomes embedded. It becomes this thing where you go like, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So when I'm listening to my favorite source of news, Comedy Central, I hear exactly that when they do their interviews on the ground, right? They put some ideas out, and I mean, I don't want to put it under that big umbrella, but MAGA Nation supports all those ideas. They support cutting spending. They support things like being more efficient. They support all of that while they're waiting in the crowd for a $45 million parade to go by. Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't occur to them. It's not even in the same brain space, because they're not tuned to it. And so this stuff, it isn't an issue. It's not something that is going to really cause a problem for them in the next election, because it all fits into this idea of us getting our way. We like this, we don't like that, and all of that's fine.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to keep moving things along, but I do want to thank you for putting the theme tune to Team America in my head, Joe. Right, so like the G7 has come and gone. I'm going to suggest we bypass it, because last week there was some research out of I can't remember who's the World Bank warned of, well, they didn't say a recession was imminent, but they did say that we're on track for the worst decade since the 1960s. Richard, do you want to just sort of give a quick overview of what that's all about and why it matters?
Well, first of all, they are seen as an authority. Whether they actually are or not can be debated, but at least it's a supranational organization with some credibility.
Yeah.
And we have grown accustomed over the last couple of years, and certainly it has intensified in what we can call the post-COVID period, that growth becomes the overarching target variable for politicians and regimes across the world. And this is very important to bear in mind, the amount of debt being accumulated at the government, state level, at the regional level of regional governments, and most of all at corporate and private levels is staggering. We have never had a world with this amount of debt being accumulated. And we touched upon it last week with Michael, how the debt super cycle rolls on. But when everyone is heavily indebted, it becomes paramount that things keep moving along. And we call that growth, because if you interrupt the status quo, you get bankruptcy. People cannot, states, regional governments, corporates, and households cannot pay their debt if you get interruptions to growth. So now, instead of being an underlying desire and quasi-target for governments around the world, it's now effectively the explicit major target variable for how you drive politics. We live in the UK, David and I. We cannot switch on the news one single time without hearing our Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, talk about the need for growth and how they're going to achieve it and the measures they're putting in place to ensure this high growth rate. Because effectively, when you look at it, you're in a debt trap. And I think that is the big message from the World Bank, is that we have sucked the proverbial marrow out of the bones over such a long time. There is nothing left on the table. So the only thing you can do is actually keep this Ponzi scheme going by not paying off your debts, but actually keep rolling them over. And to be able to roll them over, you need more growth. And they recognize that we're coming towards the end of the efficiency of this debt, and I think this is universally true when you look at previous debt bubbles. And what it means is that when you start from a low level of debt and you accumulate that and you consume it, you get growth, at least the way we're measuring it. Every dollar you accumulate in further debt leads to a very high level of growth. But as the debt pile increases, it's very much like a junkie who needs a bigger fix every time, because the actual amount from the increased level of debt that gets translated into growth lowers all the time. And I would call that rational, because the people who you depend on to drive spending forward, because spending equals growth, realize that this is unsustainable, and they're trying to save more and more for a rainy day out of that increased level of debt that particularly is happening at state level. So World Bank is effectively saying we don't have those possibilities on the debt side. And when you overlay that in the developed world with actually significantly worsening demographics, and there are very, very few countries that have reasonable demographics, the US being one of them, and it has manifested itself over the last decade or two in much higher US growth than Europe, for example, or Japan, which obviously has the worst demographic situation. And now you're throwing in the third element, which is basically the final straw on the camel's back, is we all, to various degrees, depending on our age, me being at the older end of the spectrum, has benefited for the last 3-4 decades of a world that became more and more open. Trade barriers were torn down. The world started becoming much more interconnected, which is a great move towards further efficiency. Trade is great. It actually enhances living standards. It's a smart way of ensuring that everyone gets better. It's a win-win situation. And over the last 5-6 years, and particularly, given Trump's first visit to the White House, and more so this time around, we are building up those barriers again. And World Bank is rightly pointing out that increased global friction through trade barriers and tariffs and taxes is really, really bad for growth. That's what it is. So they are lowering the outlook structurally depending on these factors. And it's very, very hard to argue with their conclusion. What it actually means on individual country level and individual households level, it has different implications. But we are going towards a slow growth world for a lot of factors that we cannot influence, like demographics, and factors that we could have influenced, like the buildup of debt, and the things that we can influence, which is politics and what that means for in terms of trade barriers.
All right. So, David, do you want to jump in before we move on, or no? All right. I'm gonna get Joe. So we'll just keep moving because I'm looking at the time. All right, Joe. So RFK Jr. sacked all of his I think 17 experts who decide the vaccination program for the US. We don't.
Yep.
We try not to focus on domestic policies, but to me, this smacks of something that could have global implications if one country is not playing their part. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the advisory committee that this is a group that has been responsible for a lot of the good advice up to this point, right? So, and also some of the bad stuff that happened, to be fair. So all that stuff during COVID, the policy, the moving out, the trying to get the vaccinations, the healthcare, thinking about how to handle the crisis. In terms of what their impact has been on America, the estimation is about 500,000 hospitalizations and deaths. So that number were prevented actually during the COVID situation because of their actions. And then in terms of what they've done for protocols, for vaccinations and all this kind of stuff, it has a great impact on the rest of the world because of the kind of information that we gain from that as well. And there is also what we call it the cultural influence of it all. So America does something and everybody else does kind of follow the trend as well. And it doesn't just come from anywhere. They actually try very hard to be they try to deconflict what they do by being quite transparent about what they say. So it's all out as much as they can. It's all out there on the website for review, right? What this change is not just about adjusting the balance. It is completely throwing out the old regime. And what's dangerous about that is it's not only been thrown out, but it's also been replaced by a regime that is shown already to have a bias in a different way. The excuse has been we're bringing in all these people so that we have a way to reestablish trust for with the American people for vaccinations and immunizations and stuff like that. And what is happening instead is the people who are being brought in are some people, well, not all of them, but some of them have been hyper skeptical about the process, and not in a scientific way, but in a way that's more about the opinion. So they're talking about the opinion without the data. So they've expressed a lot of strong opinions without strong data to support what they're saying, and that's technically unscientific. So it's being very political with science, and that can be very dangerous because people who can convince you with their words are not the people you should listen to when you're dealing with science, ultimately. Because science is about what actually happened. What does the data actually tell you about something? And so those choices that could come out of this, that's very dangerous. It also is actually about putting in a group of people who are already going to in a sense, they agree with you because you put the people you want in this particular place. And I think his big move recently, which was to, first of all, cancel all the vaccine contracts with, I think it was Moderna, to create something for the bird flu. This could really bite them in the bum. That was crazy. And then what's happened is this idea that they're going to now they're putting all the chips on a kind of a universal vaccine in terms of the, so it's a universal corona flu virus sort of idea, and it begs the question from a scientific perspective, right? Because what science actually thrives on is diversity of experiments with a broad series of results that give you an idea where different things or novel things come up, and then you can head towards the answer. And what they've done with that particular thing is they've taken funding away, essentially. And I'm kind of like conflating two things here. This committee is more about it's more about the vaccinations area, but separately as well, what they've done is they have refocused the health authorities only in certain areas, and therefore taking the focus or taking any kind of focus off other areas where they can learn stuff, and therefore defunding those as well. So I'm kind of straddling this. Every now and then I'll be producing a webinar where behind the scenes they're talking about the movement of or the non-movement of some of the graduates that are coming out, the PhDs, right, who were previously going to labs in the US, who are now just at the point where they go like, well, we're not going there anymore because the labs are being closed. All these experiments that are being done on other leading edge areas of science where maybe it's not the biggest, most prevalent problems that they're trying to solve, but it's relevant to humanity. Those kinds of things are not being funded anymore. It's just simply because of that redirection. So the politicization of the health department in the US is what I think is really dangerous, in the sense that it's not the political, it's always been political, to be honest, but it's the polarization of it that is scary.
Yeah. All right. I know, I hear a lot of people say, it's all right. All the stupid people will be killed and the rest of us can get on with it. But of course, there's a lot of people who are very, very vulnerable, including babies, which means that the mother and the baby can't even leave the house for the first year because the children are vulnerable. So there's a lot wider implications to what you're talking about. I want to run through 3 climate stories very quickly. So one of the big breaking news pieces this week is that basically by 2028, we will have released so much carbon dioxide that we have guaranteed passing the 1.5 degrees Celsius sort of heating. But they're still saying things like 50-50, and they're still saying things like 2100. It's, as far as I'm concerned, this is already a done deal, right? But this is about, they came up with an amount of CO2 that could be released, and anything beyond that, then we were going to be in trouble. So basically the conclusion is we have to reduce our energy, especially in the fossil fuel space, by 80% over the next 3 years. Now, we all know that's not going to happen, but basically everything's getting worse, and it's getting worse faster. And, we're seeing that the hurricane that hit Mexico today, it within 12 hours, it went from a 3 to a 4. But some of the media is saying it was Category 3. Some of it's saying it's Category 4. But it escalated within a 12-hour window. So that sort of thing, and David's sitting here with the T-shirt on for the first time because David and Richard are sitting in the UK and it's very hot. Well, it's also very hot here, but we're used to that. So another one that came out in Bloomberg is insurers want businesses to wake up to the cost of extreme heat. And it goes through a whole bunch of implications for extreme heat. So 500,000 people globally succumb to extreme heat every year. And obviously that number's going up. It not only kills people, it sickens people. So I've talked about kidney damage from heat. We get a lot of the migrant workers who go to the Middle East. And when they go home to India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, they're basically on kidney dialysis for the rest of their lives because of the extreme heat they've been exposed to. So any money they made in the Middle East, they're basically lost. Or they can't afford it and they die. So obviously the cascading effects of drought and wildfire. So more vegetation, it's drier, it's more flammable, the bigger fires. So, in the US, 78.5 billion was for insured wildlife losses. Oh no, that was globally. But just in, and that doesn't include Los Angeles, which was a $45 billion insurance cost. Subsistence, so fissures and cracks in the home. My mum had a house once where the earth was drying out and her house was all cracking, but that obviously increases risk, and obviously from a insurance perspective and the property market, that has an impact. Cows produce less milk when they're dealing with when they're stressed by heat. Obviously, give birth would also be a problem. Data centers, they rely on energy and water. And there's been examples already in heat extremes. Google and Oracle in 2022, heat got up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That was in London, and they had to. That impacted the data centers, but that insurance exists in a different place, so it's not always linked. So there's a whole bunch of stuff, construction firms, the people, the buildings, the materials, so that. I found it interesting that they're just starting to think about that, because obviously I've been thinking about it for a long time. Women lose babies, agriculture, they're out picking your fruit and veggie. They can lose their babies or they can lose their lives because of extreme heat. So it's a really dangerous time, but it's also, once it starts hitting the economy, then people wake up. And then the final thing is there's a story, I think it's in, so there's one in CNN in the US, 50% food reduction, food capacity, like to actually grow food by the 2050s. And that's for children born today. And then the final thing is we're changing how we holiday. So the southern parts of Europe, so Greece, Italy, Spain, Turkey, Cyprus, they're getting sort of 40, 45 degrees days. We heard last year the famous British TV presenter walked off and died. 47,000 heat-related deaths throughout Europe in 2023. So we're already starting to see the impacts, but also people are starting to change. They want to go to cooler places where they can be outside. And there's a whole tourist infrastructure in place. So are they going to be stranded assets? But it also means that they're going to be looking at building tourist destinations in northern places on the beaches where it doesn't currently happen. So that's going to create more environmental destruction. So there's so many more climate stories, but they're the ones I pulled out. Thoughts?
Well, let's go back to Richard's description of debt and what this means for it. Your costs are going to go up, your spending is going to go up, everything is going to kind of become more expensive to your life. You're going to have to try and finance that in some way, so that borrowing and that debt is going to become even more of an issue along with that. It becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. The Swiss National Bank actually reduced their interest rate down to zero rate over this week. And they kind of said they haven't considered taking it negative again. At zero rate, essentially cash becomes debt becomes cash. So what you tend to do is you tend to encourage kind of the worst of activities.
Can you explain that more? I know Richard's talked about it again, but can you explain that more, what you mean by that? Cash becomes debt?
When you go to a loan shark, you don't go to a loan shark because he charges you 30% a week kind of thing. So you borrow $10 and you got to pay 13 back by the end of the week. And a week goes by and you miss one, and that's now kind of like $17, $18, and very rapidly it becomes a real problem. And you start losing fingers and arms in that way. If he were going to charge you zero for you to borrow, and you go to the end of the week and he goes along and says, well, you can't pay me back what you have. Tell you what, I'll give you another 10 anyway and carry on through. Then you're going to take it and spend it however you do. And all of your discipline will go away. That's what will happen. All of your financial discipline will go away.
Interesting.
That's what's going to happen that's what happened when the European central banks, the Swiss National Banks, Japan, the US basically took all their interest rates down to zero following the great financial crisis. And the consequence of that was you had massive asset inflation. use the money to buy stuff, and anything that can be bought, the price of those things went up. So that's property, that's kind of like, holiday condos, whatever it is that you want to think of as a result. The environmental consequence of that is you use resources like there is no tomorrow, because there's no paying back. So your debt effectively expands away from just the financial world into that debt, into your environment, into all the resources that you're going from that. So you've actually passed what is financial debt into physical debt in a very, very stark way. And that's coming back. So the Swiss National Bank making that move is going to drive a lot of those things. And what that's going to do to the description of the temperatures that you have and all of that is it will encourage more and more oil and gas and coal use. It doesn't matter. The price can go up. I can borrow money for free. I can still go along and use it. I have already spent so much on my holiday resort. And you know what? Tell you what, I'll just make sure that the temperature inside is at 19 degrees, regardless of how hot it goes outside. And that explosion of energy, that demand that's caused by all of this, is going to accelerate the use of the use of oil and gas and coal. We're going to find that if this as one of the consequences of this.
But so, David, can I just ask you? So the people who've got their properties in the south of Europe, I'm sure many have already woken up to the fact that they should sell it now before they can't sell it. But soon there's going to be a lot.
They're not going to do that. No, the stranded asset idea is completely wrong.
Right? Why do you think that? Because eventually it's not just the property, but it's also there's going to be no agriculture growing. There's going to be no people there to serve them. There's going to be like the migration out of these places will eventually happen. I don't know when it's going to happen, but if it becomes too hot to live 6 months of the year.
Because the price of an asset is not the reality it represents. The price of the asset is the rosy picture it can have. And so from the side of any estate agent selling it, from the side of anyone looking for a property there in that way, it is actually bid up. It's not coming down because of the temperatures and the prospect of kind of no world food or whatever it is. That's why stock markets don't go down. They wobble a bit. When Tesla a few weeks ago, which you're talking about Tesla collapsing after the spate with Donald Trump, it went down to the level on the 4th of November. It's just before the Trump thing came in, kind of thing. Yeah. And people keep bidding it back up no matter what happens in it, because those who own the assets cannot afford it to go down.
And that becomes possible with zero interest rates, because if my house in Cyprus, becomes inhabitable and there's a cost for me of carrying it, then eventually it might become stranded and I have to root it out and sell it. But if it doesn't cost me anything because I can roll over the financing on that house for free, it's not a stranded asset. It's my asset, and I might use it less, which would only on the margin increase energy demand further. But it doesn't become something I'm forced to sell.
And I'm going to do the renovations to go along and bring in, air conditioners everywhere, my own kind of water extraction or whatever it is that it does, and everything that goes on through. And, pick up that value. Everything I put in there, I want to mark up on and saying what it's worth. I'm borrowing for free. During the time of the European debt crisis, around that time, or following it, when the interest rate went to zero, we had friends tell us about how they were buying yachts, mega yachts, $500 million go kind of yachts. And they're saying, well, I use it like, 2-3 weeks a year, but it's free. I can get borrowing for free. I can rent it out, and that pays for any upkeep along with it. Why wouldn't I do that? Which idiot is the one that wouldn't do that?
But even then, like from what you're both saying, this from an environment perspective, there's still an end point, right? So the people with the apartment in Cyprus with all the air conditioning units, I think it was in Rhodes, the temperature, it was somewhere between 48.5 and 49.5. The system was underground and it fell over because of the extreme heat. So you can have the nicest and the most air conditioning, but at some point there's going to be a period of time, and that period of time is going to get longer, where you just can't even be there.
This sort of instability from the financial sense is called a Minsky paradox, or Minsky's instability, after Hyman Minsky, I think. And the idea is that on the way to it, everything is great. You can keep borrowing. And there comes a point when the lenders don't want to lend. And the lenders don't want to lend is because they no longer see the same future as you. And the important thing to know about bankruptcy, to remember, is that rich people go bankrupt too. It's not because you're not rich that you go bankrupt. It's that you can't carry on rolling over the cash. That's what makes the margin call on your account, kind of wipe you out in one go. So the world is definitely heading to that. This is what we've been talking about. And governments are instrumental in maintaining this instability, in driving it up. All the comments about more efficiency, more growth, more performance. And they're doing this because they can't do without the borrowing themselves. So every party is involved in sustaining it as long as it can go on. The environment is the last straw, because you don't have to get sick. When it's hot outside, you don't work as well. You just don't work as efficiently. So this efficiency is fictitious. It's not there. And that is what's going to come on through. You're going to say, you build this here, it's going to be fantastic. But actually, the people you need to build it, you yourself, is not going to be doing it that well. So that reckoning is going to come. So the reason for lowering the interest rate now is so that you can keep doing this with a less cost to doing it, because the interest rate is now zero in that way. But ultimately, the economy breaks down when costs all go up, because everybody's buying things in this thing, so that it doesn't matter how many hours you work, you still can't make ends meet. And many people feel that now. When enough people feel that, you don't have an economy.
It certainly brings us to another fallacy, which is, how we measure inflation. We have had supposedly an inflation shock over the last couple of years, and now the justification for central banks around the world to lower rates is actually that we're past that, and it seems like inflation is falling off. There is something in inflation called hedonistic adjustment, and we can dedicate a whole show to that and the fallacy of hedonistic adjustment. But what people feel and see in their wallets and pockets doesn't tally with what the official inflation rate is showing us. And that is kind of the ultimate fallacy and the ultimate Ponzi scheme, is that we tell people inflation is lower than it actually is and what you're feeling, and therefore we can justify the game going on a bit longer and lower our interest rates at this moment in time. And it is the ultimate Ponzi scheme. Because at the end of the day, I have to eat and I have to live. And if I don't have enough money for that, and you're telling me inflation is at zero, it's not, because it's costing me 5% more than last year and I only got a 2% salary increase. I'm 3% underwater. And that's going to happen very soon. The
cost of food is just rapidly going to increase as less is available, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is really the Ponzi scheme of all time.
And it's important to kind of remember to think of one thing, which is that for all the talks about the environmental boundaries and when AMOC will collapse and all of those things, the economy will collapse way before that.
Yes.
And I don't think it's a worse recession since the 1960s. I think it's going to be worse than what the 1920s depression were.
I mean, all indications are, like that was 20% people out of work from every, and not just the environment. Then you got AI as well, right? So it's kind of. But I wanted to give Joe a chance just to talk, because we didn't have a chance to talk about it last week. So I don't know, Joe, if you saw the MIT study that was basically came out about how you use AI sort of whether it benefits your brain or doesn't. So let me just rather than just leaving you sitting there. So basically, what happened is if you create information first and then you use AI to enhance that information, your brain is still operating in a creative and all the cylinders are going. If you start with AI, basically over time you lose intelligence. So they released this report, MIT studied this week. It's not peer reviewed, and the reason they released it now rather than waiting is because they think it's really important for education. So I've been using AI that way anyway, like because I want to create my own stuff. I'm happy to have the improvement that AI can layer on top, but I don't want it thinking for me. So I thought that was really interesting. But last week we were talking about how Meta bought Scale AI, and Joe, you said this was something that frightened you. Tell us why.
Well, it made it very clear that, like one of the things that people talk about in AI. I'm going to be doing a panel on that tonight, by the way. But people talk about how there's a kind of an accidental stage we'll get to, because eventually it's going to evolve into super intelligence. Scale AI isn't in the business of accidentally doing it. It actually is in the business of getting us to super intelligence, and it does so by tagging and categorizing a lot of information. So the play that's being made by someone like Meta, to take it at that scale is very, very significant. First of all, because it's trying to take a major bite out of that market, that space, right? Because if you look at what Scale AI does currently, it actually serves all the big boys. It actually serves ChatGPT. I mean, OpenAI. It serves even X, I think, and Google. And actually, as a result of this one move, some of those big contracts actually have been cancelled because the sense that you're going to have access to understanding how Google handles its data differently from everybody else, that's so much of a secret that they want to keep, or at least an area when they want to be some separation from everybody else, that they would rather not engage something like Scale AI that has spent a lot of time developing. What Scale AI has done actually is farmed out a lot of tagging and research and all that. So it's actually created a lot of information, a lot of data. And some of the scandal behind it, of course, is that it has used labor very extensively and paid a very low price, and in some cases not even paid. There's some people have remained. There's complaints about being unpaid or what have you and all that. But essentially, it was built on labor, and it's built on labor to defeat labor as well. And it's being built to defeat not the labor that created it, but everybody else's labor, as it's trying to figure out information in all different aspects of life so that it can replace that aspect of life in a digital form, and so that it can also help the big brain, if you like, figure out what everything is tagged with, so that ultimately super intelligence can emerge out of this. So this is one aspect of it. So that's the business of it, and the fact that the company was bought, or 49% of it anyway, was bought by Meta for that big price is a big step in the market. It pushes everybody aside. The other part that's very interesting, actually, or concerning, actually, is the fact that this is actually the acquisition of talent for Meta. It's not just about the company; it's about acquisition of the talent. So the talent that comes over from this is actually the CEO of Scale AI, and he is being brought in to run the super intelligence part of Meta. So if you think about what that means down the road, and you may have seen my post where I said that, if you're afraid about not having enough time to look at Facebook, they're working to help you create a lot of time. They are actively trying to replace everyone, as in, like, if they can build super intelligence, which means build human intelligence, that means you can teach this intelligence to do the work of human beings, and therefore it would replace you. Now, that is the scary part of it, because it now isn't so much about fields. It's no longer about this area or that area where you can replace someone. It actually means that there is now the possibility that you can replace the human in the machine. You can actually, if the rest of the machine works, you could actually teach AI to play basketball like Steve Curry and be really, really good at it. If the rest of the stuff can happen, because you can build a mind that would drive it as well. So that whole thing was a little bit much to hear at the same time. I will add this other thing, though, which I read about, which is surprising, and yet is something that we should be thinking about, because the idea that we are going to get to a point where we're not going to have much to do. So this whole idea that you hear often about in AI, when talked about AI, is that where we are going to have no more jobs to do, because the work is being done by machines and all the other technologies and efficiencies that we come up with. That idea has been around for a while, and I thought it had been around maybe for the last 5-10 years. It goes back actually to the pre-1930s. I can't remember who the economist was, but the prediction back then was actually we were going to come to this. And actually the date, as I hear, that was predicted for this to happen is actually almost on the money right now for today, that we would come to the point where we would have nothing much to do. And it wasn't supposed to be a bad thing. Right?
Having nothing to do must be a bad thing.
Can you imagine? All right. I figure we should wrap up. So another big piece of news that was breaking this week was US news consumers, but I think this is actually a bit of a global phenomenon, are turning away from the traditional media. And we were talking about this after the US election, listening to people like Joe Rogan. But there's a dominantly male, dominantly right wing, these independent people, but there's a couple of left wingers. So Tyler Cohen is one, David Pakman is another. But this is where people are going for their news. And when you think about all the stuff that we're talking about right now, right, the lack of trust and the breakdown of the traditional news media is actually a huge risk for our societies moving forward. So while some people might be going, yeah, we're gonna beat those big, what do they call them? The elitist media, even though most, they're owned by people like Bezos, right? Who's getting married in Venice, and there's a big protest being called for that. Have you seen that? The Venetians are not having it. Anyway, let's wrap up. Joe, what's your AI tip of the week? Anything new that you've discovered?
Well, what I've been very impressed by actually is generative AI when it comes to creating images, right? Because I think people in their hubris to say that, oh, you know what, we're not going to be replaced. There's no way to do this, and art directors are important. I actually saw how when AI is directed really well, professionally, it will create truly professional results, and in a blink of an eye, right? It's just about being specific and clear about the instructions. You add in all the details, like the camera angle, the lens that's being used, the kind of motion that's going on, the tones, all the things that a very good art director really would say about what they're trying to conceive of a shot of like a product shot for photography, right? And almost all the machines, all the generative AI around that creates stuff that is actually pretty consistent, as in, like, even though it was sent to 3, I think in this case it was sent to 6 different engines, when it was specifically done enough, the results were close enough to each other that you could recognize and see where the creativity was being expressed. That's now amplified into the next area where video is, and that's kind of both an incredibly interesting space, but now also incredibly scary place, because I've spoken about VO3 before. This is the newest engine from Google for creating video, and it's the highest level of video creation that, I mean, regarded right now as the highest level of video creation that there is. It creates not only, of course, real looking video in the foreground, really, really good environments that look real in the background as well. And the thing that it finally defeats is this thing about, they call it uncanny valley, where you look at stuff and you go like, something isn't quite right about this. It is so good that it gets quirkiness right. So you can actually have actors, models, people performing in a way where they make those choices that really good actors do. Like if you watch, the reason why a bad actor is a bad actor is because they're too intense and always looking down the camera in a certain way. That hyper intensity, right? It's lost when you know how to make it natural and keep going. And VO3 does that, and it produces sound, and it produces sound effects. It's just so amazing and so terrible at the same time, because that is the thing that can change what our sense of reality is, right? Because we no longer know if something is not real.
That's right.
I've had this thing where in the setting that I have right now, if you look at me right now, right, I've actually recorded stuff where I say something perfectly to camera, and then I publish that, and people think it's AI. They don't think it's possible to perform like that or have whatever like this that I've got and be the real thing. So the idea of knowing what's real and not real, that is the incredible thing. So that movie Mountainhead, which not many people are getting, it's not really vibing with everyone.
Right.
That explores this really well, and I invite you to watch it, not as a terribly entertaining piece of work, but a journey into where this could go horribly wrong.
It sounds like an incredibly expensive version of LSD, really. If you're a little bit harsh, right?
Yeah, Joe, one of the things that I'm finding really, really, really tedious is, first of all, people just don't have design skills. I'm sure to get the quality of what you're talking about with the camera angles and the type of lens and all, you need to know something, right? So what I see on all social media platforms is just the same sort of textures of videos. The people look the same. They might have different faces, but it's all the same. It's the same. The words are the same. The images are the same. So it's not a creativity exercise to me. It's just everyone's, to stand out, just put your own stuff up there, take your own photos, or pay for professional photography, because you're just going to stand out because everybody else looks. And I'm seeing it in PowerPoint presentations, all AI imagery, and it just looks. I think it looks terrible. Not the quality you're talking about, the sameness.
There is this thing about taste and conformity, right? So that's something which is about fashion, and that's the way things kind of work, right? I mean, I remember being a 5-year-old in a very, very much pre-AI world, going to kindergarten that day, and I thought, oh, you know what? I know exactly what I want to do today. I'm going to bring my own Zorro whip in. I'm going to be playing with that, and it's going to be my thing. I'm the only one doing this. And I got to school that day, and I remember it really well. Everyone was doing it. Everyone had the same idea, right? And I wasn't aware about what was happening, but what I had been watching was like what everybody else was watching as well over the weekend. It was Zorro on TV, and enough of them got the same idea because whatever was in the show, inspired that. And I was exactly like everybody else, right? So I think there's a hubris to say that we are going to be unique just because we don't use AI. I actually think there is a sameness about us that we don't want to really admit. I mean, we've been to those kind of things before, right? I mean, for me, one of the funniest ideas was a whole bunch of people who show up for a metal concert. They're all dressed the same because they're different.
No. I know what you mean. I don't think I'm saying the same thing. It's a visually very boring place to be now because of that.
I think there's a radio program I heard today, not today, this week, 2 days ago, and it was about curiosity, and it was about the neurology of curiosity and how the neurotransmitters and things work. And you had this question about what will AI do to curiosity in that way. And obviously, this is something that's very much kind of an open question, and nobody yet knows, and all of that. But it reminds me of other things I heard before about how, kind of these things affect how we develop. There are certain stimulus that are meant to actually go through. There are things which are meant to be difficult to do, and our development actually relies on them in that way. And if we get the answer too quickly, it may seem like it's a good thing, but what it does is it changes the whole brain development in that way.
Yeah, I can actually see that.
So I think we're not really talking about that. We're talking about jobs and stuff, and we're missing the point, actually. What is happening is that it's changing the neurophysiology and the process it needs. There was a thing earlier also about how, a newborn child needs bacteria. A lot of those bacteria come about in contact with them out of the birth process itself. And because we've changed it for a more convenient and more direct birth process, we lose all of those things.
Yeah. I think, we've lost David. All right, let's wrap up. What's keeping you distracted? Let's do it really quick. Richard, do you want to give us one? Apart from the ice skating?
No, what's keeping me distracted is Swedish Midsummer, obviously big celebration this weekend for us and everything. And the fact, sadly, I won't be here next week because our eldest is turning 30. He's becoming officially middle-aged. So that is a bit of a distraction. Yeah.
No, it's 50 when you're middle-aged, right?
Oh, yes, of course. I'll remind him of that.
Joe?
Well, what I've been a bit distracted with is the live stream that I started. I decided to make myself super accountable for my trading. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to do all my trading live on YouTube. So I'll only sit on the platform and actually talk through my trades, because what I was very bad at doing was actually journaling as I was moving through my trades. And so I thought what I'd do is come up with a whole series of rules for myself, which include having to trade every single time live. It's not supposed to be educational. It's more about accountability, but it also means that I have to be a little bit more careful about how I show up as well. So I've been wearing a nice t-shirt every day, and I, try to make sure I'm shaven. So that's kind of something I'm doing.
At least you don't have to put makeup on.
Yeah. It's a few hours, and some of my streams are like 3 hours long, 3.5 hours long, where only one trade happens. But again, it's a lesson to myself that it is supposed to be about patience, and I'm supposed to just wait for stuff to happen. So if you'd like to watch something that can compete with perhaps paint drying or grass growing, you can look out for my live trading sessions.
Yeah, they're very therapeutic. I was watching our friend Sean. I can't remember his first, I think it's Ang. He was building a Lego ship. He's just sitting there for hours, just building a Lego ship, and it was like, wow, this is kind of, And then if you saw your name pop up, he'd talk to you for a bit, and you couldn't talk back other than in comments. But it was kind of cool. David,
cannot be married though. If you're building a Lego ship, you cannot be married. I don't think that should be possibly accepted.
I don't know if he is or not. Well, you could, but maybe married to someone who has better things to do with their time.
Was building another ship or an aeroplane next to you, possibly.
It's always the case of what you do with your mouth when you're not building the ship, right? I think if you are by building the ship, getting out of the way, it's a good thing.
David, what's keeping you distracted?
Well, so a little while back, I was having a conversation with someone about kind of balancing priorities and stuff, and there's this example of kind of you have a jar, you fill it up with sand, and then you try to put stones in there. It doesn't work. You put the stones in first, and then you kind of fill it up, and eventually you can pour all that on there. And it was and the purpose of that was, get yourself organized with the big things and carry on with that. So I did that with a little, tomato, chopped tomato can, get some pebbles and just pour the things in there, just to be physical, just to be real. And then I had some tomatoes, not out of the can, but some fresh tomatoes along. I scooped some of the seeds and I chucked it in there, and they grew.
Nice.
So, just sand, water, gravel, and that sort of thing, and it grew. And it's like, oh, wow, I've got 4 little tomato plants. Let's see what happens next. So there you go. That's been distracting me.
Nice. I'm trying to get some avocados to sprout. I haven't had any luck yet, but I'm going to keep going. If you're looking for something kind of weird and wonderful to watch, I suppose, it's a 2017 series called Taboo, starring Tom Hardy. Did you ever watch it? It's kind of sort of back in the 1800s England. He's got magical powers that sort of go back to the fact that he's got an American Indian mother, and he spent time in Africa. It's about the East India Company, but to me, it's just it's lots of things, but it's also societal judgment as it was then. And you're kind of looking at it, it's like it hasn't really changed that much. The East India Company, evil bastards. Fascinating. Makes me want to go and get one of the books that talks about the history of it and read it. I've read it years ago. I read something. I want to read it again just to be reminded about what those guys did. And I think a lot of what they did back then is part of the problem that we're dealing with right now. And we were gonna do a colonialism and sustainability talk, and I still want to do that at some point because I think it's really important. But anyway, Taboo, Tom Hardy, incredible actor. So that's how we're keeping ourselves distracted. We've got about halfway through. So I recommend it.
There you go.
If you haven't seen it. All right. We're going to go. Joe's going to go and talk about AI on a panel. Give him some honest truth. And we'll see you all in a week. And we'll let you know. We're lining up guests. If you want to come and join us, you're always welcome. You just need to be able to talk about any of the topics within the context of the polycrisis. So you can talk about all of it, or you can talk about a piece of it. That's what we're looking for. So we'll see you then. Keep the faith. Yeah.
Always.
Yep.
Yeah.
Happy midsummer.
Happy
midsummer.
Yep. Enjoy and enjoy your daughter's confirmation as well.
Yes.
All right.
Finish cooking, get things ready. Yep.
Yeah. No, see you guys.
Get things out of this.